Woodstock, 1969. It's the peak of America's counterculture movement. Over 400,000 people gathered for what's supposed to be a celebration of peace, love, and music. 400,000 people who oppose America's war in Vietnam. 400,000 people who think the government needs to change. 400,000 people who won't be voting for Richard Nixon in the next election. Woodstock is the biggest gathering of anti-war activists America had ever seen. But suddenly, the clouds got darker. A powerful downpour covers the entire festival ground in water. The fields turn into mud pools. People are uncomfortable, some get injured, and some decide it's better just to go home. And within just a few hours, a music festival that could have created the kind of unity and message that could change American history forever descended into utter chaos. But the interesting thing was, just before the downpour, some festival goers had noticed something weird. There were planes flying above the festival grounds, emitting strange smoke into the storm clouds. As one Woodstock attendee said to a reporter, "I got something to say, I want to know how come the fascist pigs have been seeding the clouds. We could see the airplanes going over twice while all the smoke coming out of them seeding the clouds. Why doesn't the media report that stuff to the people? Could it be that the government had really made it rain? Were those planes up there seeding the clouds to make the rain even worse, in hopes that it would bring the festival to an end? Obviously not, right? There's no way the government can control the weather. I mean, you're telling me the government sent planes up and these planes poured some kind of smoke into the clouds to make it rain? You're saying the government was trying to play God? That definitely doesn't sound like something they would do." But in reality, what these festival goers thought happened at Woodstock was not just some baseless theory. It was a very real possibility. Since the early 1940s, the American government had been actively and openly experimenting with weather control, and they haven't tried to hide it. And back when Woodstock happened, the government was actually testing its cloud seeding abilities all over the world. Cloud seeding was not and never has been just a baseless theory. It's a well-documented practice. So could Woodstock have been a target? Well, it makes sense if it was. Woodstock was everything the government was afraid of: anti-war activism, rebellion, and unity. If Woodstock was a total success, it would prove to the world that those hippies could actually be right, that maybe we could come together and create change. And that was a direct threat to those in power. Considering all of this, why wouldn't have Woodstock been a target? But the problem for the government was, if they just sent in police or soldiers to break it up, well, that would just prove the point Woodstock was trying to make. But if the festival simply just shut down because of an unnatural amount of rain that made the festival grounds dangerous and unusable, well, no one would ever bat an eye at that. And it wouldn't have been the first or last time the US government used weather control for its own benefits. From Vietnam to Florida, weather control or weather modification has always been a huge interest to governments all over the world. We've seen floods in Dubai, snow in Saudi Arabia, hurricanes in the US that seem to intensify out of nowhere. All natural disasters according to the government. And sure, many of them are probably natural. But what if some of them aren't? What if some of them are a direct result of weather control experiments? The kind of weather control experiments the governments of these countries are doing wide in the open. And if they're already doing this out in the open, how much more are they doing in secret? How far have they pushed this technology in secret? And what happens when they push Mother Nature too far? Stay dangerous and let's take a look at weather control. You know what's just as unpredictable as the weather? Handling shipping for your business. One moment everything is calm, and the next you're drowning in logistics chaos. But thankfully, that's where ShipStation comes in, today's sponsor. With ShipStation, you can save up to 88% on shipping with UPS, USPS, DHL, and up to 90% with FedEx. But that's just the cherry on top. Because the real magic is how much time and stress it will save you. Instead of spending hours coordinating deliveries, ShipStation pulls all your orders from Shopify, Amazon, Etsy, and more all into one simple dashboard. And from the dashboard, you'll be able to automate everything, including finding the lowest rates, printing labels in bulk, and sending branded tracking updates to your customers. No more headaches, no more hours on the phone or sending emails, just more time and more money to focus on the parts of your business that truly matter to you. That's why over 130,000 companies, including Joe Rogan's brand Onnit, use ShipStation to handle their logistics. And the best part is that you can try completely for free using the link below. So if you're a company that ships your own goods, you gotta at least try with the link below. Signing up takes less than 5 minutes. Just create an account, connect your merchant platform on Shopify, Amazon, Etsy, or eBay, and say goodbye to the most time-consuming part of running an e-commerce business. Just go to shipstation.com/JakeTran right now to get a 60-day free trial. That's shipstation.com/JakeTran with the link below. The idea that humans can control weather is nothing new, and people have been trying to do it since the beginning of humanity. In the 1500s, they rang church bells during storms to drive off the demons in the clouds that were responsible for thunder, lightning, and hail. Over the next few centuries, so many bell ringers died from lightning strikes that they eventually switched from bells to gunfire. But then in the 1800s, people thought that the sound and force of cannons might be enough to break up the storms. so they built giant hail cannons that fired directly into storm clouds. Unfortunately, like the bells, the cannons killed a lot more people than any storm would have. Falling cannonballs and malfunctioning cannons that exploded on the ground killed hundreds of bystanders over the years. Still, so many people believed in the storm blasting method that in some places they kept shooting their hail cannons well into the 1900s. And the logic made sense for the times. If those clouds are what's causing the storms, if we broke up the clouds with cannonballs, maybe we'll stop it. And it wasn't long before real scientists hopped on this weather control bandwagon, and they started looking for methods that were more rooted in reality and less in superstition. And that's where James P. Espy, also known as the Storm King, came in. In the 1830s, James Espy was one of the first scientists to figure out how clouds are formed. He expanded this theory to cover the creation of storms too. And even though he was later proven wrong about the storm thing, not the cloud thing, this was the first time anyone had offered a better explanation for storms and clouds than that evil demons created them. As part of his research, Espy published a book called The Philosophy of Storms, and in it, he suggested that if you burned parts of the Appalachian forest, it would create artificial rain during a drought. He believed that the warm air and change in air pressure would force clouds to make rain. Even though his theory was very wrong, it was the first time someone had taken a scientific approach to trying to modify the weather. And it was the first time anyone in the world openly spoke about controlling the weather to the point where you could create rain on demand. Over the next century, very few scientists actually gave much thought to the whole weather control thing, but it didn't entirely disappear. Every now and then someone would come up with a theory or experiment, but nothing ever really panned out until the 1940s. That's when two men working for General Electric, Vincent J. Schaefer and Irving Langmuir, had discovered how to seed clouds to make them produce snow or rain. Basically, cloud seeding just means pouring chemicals directly into rain clouds to force them to drop their rain on command. And they did this by using dry ice to freeze water droplets in specific clouds. These droplets would become heavier and eventually fall as rain or snow. Soon enough, they found that silver iodide, a gray powder, was even better at making clouds turn into rain. This new discovery had two clear benefits. One, it could force certain clouds to produce rain immediately, wherever and whenever they wanted them to. And two, if you didn't want it to rain somewhere, you could see clouds before they reached that location, so they would dump their rain right then and there. Schaefer and Langmuir had literally figured out how to control the weather. Civilizations rise and fall based on weather alone. And with enough time and money, one could make a barren wasteland flourish. One could even flood your enemy. Those who figured out how to control the weather could be more powerful than Mother Nature herself. And whenever that sort of power is available, it doesn't take long for the government to get involved. Like most stuff we talk about on this channel, the push to explore weather control began as a well-meaning way to save or improve people's lives, but it quickly turned into something much darker. In 1947, the US government partnered with General Electric to figure out how they could use cloud seeding to modify a hurricane. The idea was that dropping dry ice into a hurricane while it was still out at sea could disrupt its structure, weaken its winds, and basically make it run out before it hit land. If it worked, there would be a guaranteed way to get rid of hurricanes before they caused any damage, and that could potentially save hundreds of thousands of lives. So the government created Project Cirrus and started figuring out how they could actually test something like this. Right from the start, the scientists involved knew things could go really wrong if they didn't carry out these experiments the right way. They would have to be extremely careful about the hurricane they chose to seed, and they would have to pick one that wasn't going anywhere near land. And on October 13, 1947, they finally got their chance. For 4 days, scientists had carefully monitored a medium-sized cyclone that formed in the southern part of the Caribbean Sea. In the first few days after forming, the storm hit Cuba with minimal damage. Following its path, it looked like the cyclone was heading out to sea, far away from anything it could cause damage to. It was a good storm to use for Project Cyrus's first experiments. So on October 13th, a B-17 bomber plane flew into the cyclone and dropped 80 kilograms of crushed dry ice directly into the eye of the storm. And all that was left to do was to wait and watch. If the experiment worked, the cyclone would temporarily get more intense before dissipating soon afterwards. And at first, everything seemed to be going as planned. The storm got worse, turning into a full-blown hurricane, but that was what everyone expected. What no one saw coming though was that within hours of that cloud seeding, the cyclone-turned hurricane made an abrupt change in direction, heading directly towards the mainland. On October 15th, it made landfall, slamming into Savannah, Georgia, before moving into South Florida, causing some of the worst flooding the region had ever seen. In total, the hurricane cost more than $3 million in damage, or over $42 million in today's money. People were furious. The government had not hidden their interest in cloud seeding, but they refused to admit that they had seeded that hurricane that hit Florida and Georgia. But it didn't matter though. Soon enough, local newspapers started speculating that the government's meddling had caused this disaster. One Miami weatherman went so far as to claim the hurricane wasn't just an act of God, but instead it was a low Yankee trick. If Project Cirrus hadn't seeded the cyclone, it may have never turned into a hurricane or changed its course towards the mainland. And in good old government fashion, the people in charge of Project Cirrus stayed completely silent. No one has said a word about whether the cyclone had been seeded until 12 years later. No one except Irving Langmuir, the guy who originally discovered cloud seeding, and who also happened to be a Nobel Prize winner for chemistry. According to him, the hurricane's track had been directly influenced by human intervention. It also didn't help that General Electric immediately backed out of Project Cirrus, worried about the possible lawsuits they would face for interfering in storms that caused so much damage. But even though everyone else was on damage control, the government still refused to admit that they had anything to do with what happened to the hurricane, that there was nothing to be suspicious about. But still, people wouldn't stop talking about it. And with so much publicity and suspicion, Project Cirrus became a much bigger liability than it was worth, and eventually it was shut down. But the idea didn't die. Instead, the government waited for everyone to forget about Project Cirrus and the damage it may or may not have caused, and in 1962, it relaunched the program under a brand new name, Project Storm Fury. It was 15 years later better funded and with better science to back it up. And for the next 20 years, the government carried out dozens of seeding experiments, this time using silver iodide instead of dry ice. And even though these experiments did seem to affect hurricanes and sometimes even weaken them, it didn't seem like cloud seeding had a strong or clear enough effect to make the project worthwhile. And then there were the risks. What if seeding a storm made it more unpredictable or caused unintended damage? The memory of Project Cirrus was still fresh in the government's mind, and there was no way it could handle another disaster like that. So in 1983, after years of failing to achieve anything, Project Storm Fury was quietly cancelled in hopes the public would forget all about it. It was obvious the government wanted as little publicity around cloud seeding as possible. But why? Well, while everyone was suspiciously watching Project Storm Fury to see what chaos it would cause, the US government had found another very different use for cloud seeding, a use that it would much rather keep secrets. So you're a communist soldier in Vietnam in the late 1960s. You've grown used to the rhythm of the monsoon season. Every year, heavy rain pours through the jungle, and it makes everything wet, slippery, and miserable. Despite this, every year's monsoon season is predictable. You know what to expect, you know how to prepare, but suddenly something changes. The storms you know so well become fiercer and more relentless. More rain pours down than you've ever seen in your life. Some say it's just a rainier year than the ones you're used to, but you know that something isn't right. Because this new heavy rain isn't happening all over Vietnam. No, this new heavy rain is only happening in places that are strategically important to the Communist Army. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, which transports all your weapons and supplies, has turned into a death trap of landslides and flooding. And all of your anti-aircraft missile launch sites seem to be hit the hardest, blocking them from shooting down planes. Even weirder, it seems like every time there's a really heavy rainstorm, the Americans benefit from it somehow. Either the rain breaks up protests against the capitalist side, or the rain stops just as the Americans start their bombing campaigns. For someone who spent their entire life in Vietnam, it all feels so unnatural, almost targeted. And you're not alone. In the late 1960s, this strange weather seemed like a cruel twist of fate to millions of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians. But it wasn't fate. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act of war carried out by the United States. You see, the US had been trying to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail for years with no luck. Conventional bombing just wasn't doing the trick, but that's when they got a brilliant idea. Why not seed the monsoon rain clouds above the trail? The extreme rainfall would make it too dangerous for anyone to use, and on top of that, rainfall was much more PR friendly than bombs. In the words of one government official back then, what's worse, dropping bombs or rain? The government called this little project Operation Popeye, and it was so important to the American war effort in Vietnam, and it was so controversial for its time, that when White House officials were asked about it, they just flat out replied, "This is one of those things where no one is going to say anything." It started in 1967, where every monsoon season, American planes would fly over the targeted regions and release silver iodide into the clouds. Their cloud seeding worked so well that they made it their goal to extend every monsoon season by up to 45 days, softening the roads, washing away bridges, and causing landslides wherever they needed them. Between 1967 and 1972, the US carried out more than 2,600 cloud seeding operations over Laos and Vietnam. In some cases, planes would fly out twice a day to seed clouds above a single target. And it worked. The cloud seeding flooded roads and broke down communications between communist soldiers without anyone ever realizing that the Americans were the ones behind it. Operation Popeye went as far as to develop a chemical that could even produce acidic rainfall aimed at destroying the enemy's radar equipment. For 5 years, America played God with Vietnam, creating and stopping rain as it saw fit. And thanks to the secrecy around Operation Popeye, it took 5 years for the public to even catch a whiff of these specifics. And not even the White House could 100% agree whether it was the right thing to do. One official was worried that rainmaking might violate what we consider the general rule of thumb of an illegal weapon of war, something that would cause unusual suffering or disproportionate damage, which is saying a lot considering that the US used Agent Orange in Vietnam around the same time. And if Agent Orange was fine, but cloud seeding was potentially illegal, just how bad did the cloud seeding get? And how much damage did it cause? We may never know. Even after the operation was exposed, very little information about it was ever released. We may never even know the true extent of the cloud seeding missions. The government was doing everything it could to keep it all a secret, but eventually some of the truth came out. In 1971, journalists started reporting on rumors of cloud seeding in Vietnam. They followed these rumors like breadcrumbs until the truth was finally revealed and exposed in a huge article published by the New York Times. And this was in the 1970s, which brings us back to the original question of this video. The US government was using cloud seeding as a weapon between 1967 and 1972. The disaster at Woodstock happened in 1969, at the height of America's little cloud seeding operation. Considering that, what are the chances that those guys we showed you at the beginning of the video were onto something? Think about it, the day the festival started, there was zero sign of rain. It was a warm, sunny August day, when suddenly, the few clouds that had gathered turned dark and stormy, before pouring down more rain than anyone in the area had seen in years. Isn't it weird that the rain continued for the entire weekend, disrupting the festival from start to end? The people who attended Woodstock were some of the most outspoken against the war in Vietnam. The entire festival was pretty much based on anti-war sentiments. It was a thorn in the government's side, an annoying headache that was at risk of turning into something much bigger. So why wouldn't the government use cloud seeding to put a damper on the festival? Either way, the secret was out. By 1972, everyone knew the US government had the ability to control the rain. Everyone realized just how much power that gave them, and everyone knew it was time to do something about it. Imagine a world where you could control your enemy's weather, like America did in Vietnam. You could bring down months of endless rain, flooding their roads, destroying their supply chains, and injuring or even killing their people. Crops would rot in the fields, causing food shortages, and the country's entire focus would completely shift from making war to dealing with a natural disaster back home. Or you can make the opposite happen. You could see clouds long before they reach your enemy's land, plunging your enemy into a drought that dries up their rivers, that kills their crops. See, in ancient times, armies would lay siege to cities, slowly starving the people inside until the king surrendered. Now, the same thing would be possible on a much bigger, much more deadly scale. And what if, like people suspected with Project Cirrus, the government could control the power and course of hurricanes? Imagine a world where hurricanes and cyclones mysteriously shift the course, slamming into major cities, destroying infrastructure, and plunging millions of people into chaos. Weaponizing the weather had the potential to turn warfare into something much more destructive than bombs or bullets, and by the early 1970s, everyone knew it. You see, while people who worry about weather control today are called crazy conspiracy theorists, in the 1970s, weather modification as a weapon of war was a harsh reality. It was such a real threat that the UN proposed a treaty that banned weather control as a weapon all the way back in 1976. Thanks to massive pressure from politicians and the people, even America sat down to talk about making weather modification an illegal weapon. The treaty, called the Environmental Modification Convention, or ENMA, was signed by 48 countries. And basically, it banned military use of environmental modification techniques that would cause widespread, long-lasting, or severe damage. Which raises the question, if weather control isn't real, if it's impossible to control the weather or use it to your advantage, why would there need to be a treaty that bans it? And before America was forced into signing the treaty, it was pouring millions into projects to see just how far they could take it. And one of those projects was Nile Blue, which tried to create a computerized model of the world's climate as a way to manipulate weather patterns on a global scale. In their opinion, controlling the weather would allow America to disrupt the economy and social structure of any small country by forcing it into famine or at least extreme hardship. Add the Cold War into the mix, and imagine a world where there wasn't just a nuclear war to worry about, but wide-scale weather warfare as well. Just think about it, it took decades for the Soviets and Americans to agree that maybe blowing each other up with nuclear bombs was a bit extreme, but weaponized weather? They both agreed to hit the brakes after less than 10 years. That's how powerful and dangerous weather control was and still is. But even then, this MMOD treaty wasn't perfect. It banned large-scale use of weather control as a weapon, but smaller localized manipulations of the weather weren't completely ruled out. So even though Russia and America couldn't flood each other anymore, using weather modification as a weapon here and there is still technically allowed. And even today, weather modification on its own without the weaponizing part is being used by more countries than you may expect. The United Arab Emirates, or UAE, is one of the driest countries on Earth. Unlike other countries like Egypt and Libya, the UAE has no permanent rivers or lakes. That's why the country has to import over 85% of its food. Even though the UAE may be rich enough to afford these imports, having to import all your food is a major risk. On top of that, every year hundreds of thousands of people move into the country, massively increasing the demand for food. So finding a way to grow its own food was a big deal for the UAE government. But in order to make that happen though, they would need rain. They needed rain for the farms, they needed rain to keep the taps on, which is where cloud seeding came in. Since the 2000s, the UAE has launched hundreds of cloud seeding missions every year, near its mountainous border with Oman. Their goal? To boost the country's water reservoirs and to keep its cities and farms from running dry. And it's working. Kind of. Depending on conditions, cloud seeding can boost rainfall by 10 to 30%. And sure, that might not sound like that much, but to them, every drop counts. And they've been taking it even further. In 2015, they launched the Research Program for Rain Enhancement Science, offering grants to scientists around the world to push the technology even further. They've even teamed up with NASA to figure out how they can make more rain. So as you can see, they're not trying to hide the fact that they're cloud seeding. They're not doing it in secrets. They've been cloud seeding for decades and reaping the benefits. And it's not just the UAE. There's a much bigger, much more well-known country that also used weather control not too long ago. In July 2001, China celebrated a huge victory. It had won the bid to host the 2008 Summer Olympics. And this wasn't just about sports. For China, it was a chance to finally prove to the world that it was a modern, friendly, successful country. Billions of dollars were poured into new infrastructure, and everything was planned down to the last detail to make sure the event was completely unforgettable. But there was just one problem: Beijing's weather. The Olympics were scheduled for August, in the middle of the region's rainy season, and rainstorms during the games would wreak havoc to the live performances. And it would just be not a good experience, which is where the Beijing Weather Modification Office came in. The Beijing Weather Modification Office is part of a national weather control program that is supposed to be the biggest in the world, and they have been working on modifying the weather for decades, with some pretty interesting results. In 2006, a sandstorm hit Beijing, covering the entire city in dust. In response, the Weather Modification Office launched a massive cloud seeding project to wash away the sand. This resulted in the heaviest rain the city has seen the entire season, and it wasn't just useful in emergencies. In 1997, as a little gift to the people of Beijing, the office seeded the clouds to bring down even more snow to cover the city for New Year's. So by 2008, it's safe to say that the office knew what they were doing. Using a specialized supercomputer, the office would monitor weather patterns across 17,000 square miles of land that surrounded the city. Once heavy rain clouds were identified moving towards Beijing, planes, rockets, and anti-aircraft guns, loaded with silver iodide and dry ice, would seed the clouds while they were still far away from the capital, forcing them to release their rain early over rural areas outside of the city limits. And if the clouds moved too quickly and reached the city before they were seeded, they would spray them with liquid nitrogen in an attempt to shrink the raindrops so they stayed in the air longer, delaying any rainfall. And surprisingly, their plan worked. The opening ceremony went off without a hitch under clear blue skies, while the rest of the games also stayed mostly dry. But while China was celebrating its success, others weren't as happy. Changing the weather across such a big region was bound to cause unintended consequences. Forcing rain to fall in one region could disrupt rainfall somewhere else, potentially affecting China's neighbors. And who knew what else is meddling in the weather would do to everyone around the world as well. In 2019 and 2024. The UAE is flooded by record rains twice in the space of 5 years. The 5th driest country on Earth, with less than 100 millimeters of rainfall a year, gets flooded by a rainstorm. And the April 2024 floods were catastrophic. In Al Ain, about 60 miles from Dubai, 256 millimeters of rain fell in just 24 hours. That's more than double the city's annual average. Streets became rivers, cars were washed away, and entire neighborhoods were submerged in water. The city's infrastructure, never designed to handle this kind of rainfall, completely failed. Meteorologists blamed a low-pressure system that trapped warm, moist air over the region. Basically, they said it was weird but a 100% natural event. But coming from a country who's never seen this kind of rainfall pretty much ever, very few people actually believed it. There was no way this sort of rainfall just happened naturally. But wait, doesn't the UAE carry out thousands of cloud seeding missions every year? Don't they target every single cloud that might produce rain because they have so few of them to begin with? Could the flooding and rainstorms of 2024 have been caused by cloud seeding? According to the UAE government, absolutely not. They didn't carry out any cloud seeding missions before or during the floods. But then again, the only other time the country has seen rain as bad as this was back in 2019, and back then, the government openly admitted that the heavy rainfall was probably caused by their cloud seeding. In November 2024, something strange also happened in the Saudi Arabian desert. It snowed. For the first time in history, huge parts of Saudi Arabia were covered in a blanket of snow, and no one could understand why. Like in the UAE, meteorologists said something about a low-pressure system and moist air again. But this wasn't just rain or a drizzle, it was snow. Real actual snow. In a country that's never seen snow for its entire recorded history. And would you look at that, Saudi Arabia also does cloud seeding too. In fact, just 2 months before the snowfall, the Saudi Arabian government actually announced that it was going to ramp up its cloud seeding efforts and target even more parts of the country than ever before. And remember, cloud seeding isn't just for making rain. Back in the early days when cloud seeding was just invented, they used dry ice to create snow as well. And if weather control has this big of an impact on countries who are just starting to experiment with it, how much more has artificial weather control affected America, given that we were the ones that came up with it in the first place all those years ago? 2023 and 2024. The US faces back-to-back hurricanes that leaves entire towns underwater and chaos everywhere. And it seemed like these storms were only getting stronger, which most people blamed on climate change. But for some, things aren't so simple. It's hard to forget the fact that the very first experiments in weather control were conducted on hurricanes, or the fact that cloud seeding, which was supposed to make hurricanes weaker, seemed to make them worse first instead. Or even the fact that it took the government 12 years to admit that they seeded a hurricane that turned bad. Could it be that hurricanes like Helene and Milton were just another well-intentioned experiment gone bad? Could it be that so much weather modification is happening right now that we're just screwing with Mother Nature too much? And that extreme stuff like this is the result? Who knows? But what about the LA fires? Well, I've talked to a few firefighters out there, and they said that when they all first studied fire science out there, they all learned that one day, because of how that terrain is, if the wind got strong enough, there would be no stopping a fire from destroying everything to the beach. Now, is there negligence involved? It looks like it. Could there be arson involved? Absolutely, especially with homeless people. Are the leaders in LA and California completely useless and corrupt? Absolutely. But for those who live there, you know that every year these strong winds pick up, and every couple years there's always fires. But is weather modification specifically involved? It could be, but I haven't seen any good evidence for it yet. And if anything comes up, I'll update you guys. So can the government control the weather? Yes, and they've been doing it for a very long time. Can they modify it however they want with precision? Probably not yet. But with the power of AI, it's probably just around the corner. And it's not just the weather they control, it's everything. The environment we live in, our privacy, our ability to travel, our taxes, and even the money we make. It's all designed to keep us enslaved in the middle and lower class, so those at the top can maintain their power. The middle and lower class do all the grunt work, they make those at the top richer, and yet no matter how hard they work, no matter how many decades they put in, they always find themselves at the end of their lives with not enough money, and all out of time. And you hear stories like this all the time because it's by design. But thankfully, with Trump in office, whether you like him or not, this is your one shot, your one opportunity to escape the middle and lower class and become free. But it's not gonna last forever. Which is why I recently made this video where I go over exactly how the system is designed to keep you trapped, and how to leverage the biggest trends in 2025 to break free. You can watch it right now by clicking the card on the screen or clicking the link below. So click the card on the screen or click the link below right now, and find out how you too can break free from enslavement and take back control of your life.